Have you ever wondered why your sense of self can feel so fragile? Why the truth seems to slip through your grasp like water between your fingers? This is not madness, it is manipulation. Gaslighting, the ancient art of warping the mind, eroding certainty, and making reality a contested ground. Two voices rise from the echoes of history. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic, teaches that freedom is built atop the unyielding stone of reason. Niccolò Machiavelli, master strategist, unveils how perception can be twisted to command, as kings and shadows both have learned. Gaslighting is not the simple act of lying, it is the relentless reshaping of perception until the victim's memory, judgment, and spirit have been conquered. Rulers, lovers, tyrants, it is a weapon as old as power itself. But there are defenses, carved from wisdom and tempered by clarity. If you wish to understand the roots of psychological manipulation, and more crucially, how to resist, remain with us. Before we pull back the curtain on gaslighting, if you value this kind of thinking, subscribe. We publish weekly on how to see systems before they own you. This is Marcus versus Machiavelli. The battle for your mind begins now. The human mind is a fortress. It rests upon the bedrock of memory, perception, and judgment. For millennia, philosophers have understood that our greatest power lies not in what we possess, but in what we know to be true, our inner citadel, the conviction that we are the architects of our own reality. But what happens when someone methodically dismantles those walls? Gaslighting emerges from the shadows of human nature. It is not a crude assault on the body, but a calculated siege against the mind. The perpetrator begins subtly, a contradiction here, a denial there. That never happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're too sensitive. These are not careless words. They are precision instruments. Over time, the victim begins to doubt not just individual memories, but the very apparatus of their perception. Am I losing my mind? Is my reality flawed? The gaslighter has achieved something extraordinary. They have made their victim complicit in their own psychological imprisonment. The term itself draws from history. In the depths of past homes, gas lamps flickered and dimmed when valves were turned, yet the abuser would insist the light had never changed, even as the victim watched it fade. Your eyes deceive you. Trust me, not what you see. This is the essence of gaslighting, the systematic replacement of external truth with the perpetrator's narrative. And it works because it exploits a fundamental human weakness, our need to trust, to believe, to be certain of reality itself. The question before us is not how gaslighting happens. We know that. The question is, how do we resist it? How do we fortify our minds against those who would twist our perception? The mental trap, how gaslighting destroys reason.
A man who understands himself cannot be deceived. You speak of gaslighting as though it were some irresistible force, but it is nothing more than noise, meaningless noise. The gaslighter relies upon one fundamental assumption, that their victim has no command over their own mind. But the Stoic knows better. He knows that between stimulus and response lies a vast space. In that space, he exercises choice. Not over external events, these are not in our control, but over judgment, over assent, over the interpretations we place upon what occurs. When a gaslighter says, "You are remembering it wrong," I do not immediately accept this as truth. I pause, I examine, I ask, what do I know with certainty? What is conjecture? What is interpretation? The mind that has learned to distinguish between these is not vulnerable to manipulation. The fortress is not impregnable because the walls are thick. It is impregnable because the keeper of the fortress, the rational mind, has trained itself to examine every claim before admitting it through the gates. This is the power of reason tempered by virtue. Consider the man who has disciplined his mind through years of philosophical practice. He has learned to observe his own thoughts as a scientist observes phenomena in nature. He does not cling to his beliefs as though they were treasures to be defended. Rather, he holds them lightly, ready to release them if evidence demands it. Such a man is antithetical to the gaslighter's design. The gaslighter seeks a victim who will desperately defend their initial perception, who will become emotionally entangled in their version of events. But the trained mind remains detached. It observes, it questions, it remains free. Gaslighting succeeds only when the victim has surrendered their faculty of judgment. It succeeds when they have placed their trust so thoroughly in the manipulator that they question their own perception more readily than they question the other's words. This is a failure not of the mind's architecture, but of the mind's discipline. The antidote to gaslighting is not blind confidence in one's own memories. It is something far more subtle and powerful, the cultivation of a mind that remains perpetually awake to its own fallibility, yet grounded in principles that cannot be shaken.
Aurelius speaks of reason as though it were a weapon forged in steel, unchanging and absolute, but he misunderstands human nature profoundly. You see, reason is not humanity's greatest strength. It is humanity's most useful fiction, the story we tell ourselves to believe we are rational agents in control of our destiny. But we are not. We are creatures of emotion, attachment, and need. And it is precisely in this gap between the myth of reason and the reality of human weakness that I work. Gaslighting functions because it exploits this fundamental delusion. The victim believes in reason, in memory, in their perception. They believe these things are solid. But I know what Aurelius refuses to acknowledge. These things are profoundly fragile. They are not facts etched into stone. They are constructions, narratives, interpretations subject to constant revision. When I tell a man, "You are remembering it wrong," I am not attacking his fortress. I am introducing doubt into his foundation. And doubt is the most corrosive substance known to human consciousness. Doubt spreads. It metastasizes. It transforms certainty into question, conviction into hesitation. Watch how it works. A woman believes her husband said something cruel to her. She remembers it vividly. But her husband denies it. Not merely denies it, he expresses shock, hurt, wounded at the suggestion that he would say such a thing. He questions her memory gently, with apparent concern for her mental state. "Are you feeling all right? Perhaps you dreamed this. Stress can cause these confusions." The woman begins to wonder, "Did I imagine it?" She reviews her memory again and again, searching for inconsistencies. And in that searching, the very act of doubt begins to erode her confidence. The memory, which was once solid, becomes liquid. The genius of gaslighting is that it does not rely upon the victim being weak. Indeed, it works most effectively upon those who are intelligent and reflective, because such people are accustomed to questioning themselves, to considering alternative explanations, to remaining open to the possibility that they might be wrong. I take this admirable quality, this hunger for accuracy, and I turn it inward. I weaponize their own intelligence against them. The victim becomes complicit in their own unraveling, convinced that they are being fair, balanced, reasonable in doubting themselves. I have observed this countless times in the halls of power. The intellectual is more vulnerable than the fool. The sensitive is more vulnerable than the callous. The dependent, whether economically or emotionally, is more vulnerable than the independent. These are not coincidences. They are the laws of psychological domination. The gaslighter exploits the victim's strengths, not their weaknesses. And this is what Aurelius, for all his philosophical sophistication, fails to grasp.
You attribute to your manipulations a power they do not possess, Machiavelli. You suggest that the intelligent are more vulnerable precisely because they question themselves. But this confuses the capacity for self-examination with the habit of self-surrender. There is a profound difference between a man who questions his initial judgment in order to arrive at truth, and a man who abandons his judgment because his confidence has been systematically eroded. The Stoic does not cling to his initial perception with the desperation of a man who fears being wrong. He examines it with the curiosity of a man who wishes to know truth. There is a discipline to this. When a gaslighter introduces doubt, the trained mind asks, "Is this doubt arising from genuine evidence that contradicts my recollection? Or is it arising from the manipulator's design?" These are not the same. One leads to wisdom, the other leads to imprisonment. You speak of the woman doubting her memory when her husband denies his words. But consider, had this woman cultivated the practice of careful observation early in her life, she would have done more than merely remember. She would have examined her husband's character. She would have observed patterns. She would have asked herself difficult questions about why she remained dependent on a man capable of such manipulation. The fortress is not built in a moment. It is built through years of discipline, and once built, it does not crumble at the first wind of contradiction. What you describe is not the vulnerability of reason itself. It is the tragedy of those who have never been taught to use reason properly. Reason is not a fixed attribute. It is a skill. It must be cultivated. The person who has done this work, who has learned to observe themselves, to test their judgments, to remain open to correction while maintaining intellectual independence, such a person is precisely the opposite of vulnerable. They are fortified against all forms of manipulation because they have already immunized themselves against the primary weapon of the gaslighter, the erosion of confidence through seduction into doubt.
And yet, Aurelius, you lived in a palace. You commanded legions. Your pronouncements carried the weight of empire. It is easy to speak of fortress building and mental discipline when one possesses supreme authority. But what of the servant, the subordinate, the person whose survival depends upon the approval of the manipulator? You assume the victim possesses the psychological space to engage in your extended philosophical reflection. But this is precisely what the gaslighter takes away. The gaslighter does not engage in abstract debate about truth with his victim. He creates conditions of uncertainty, conditions of fear, conditions of isolation. The victim is too exhausted, too frightened, too dependent to engage in your disciplined reasoning. When a man's employment depends upon his employer's goodwill, when a woman's survival depends upon her partner's approval, the luxury of philosophical detachment evaporates. The mind becomes anxious, reactive, desperate to appease. And in this state, this is the state in which gaslighter flourishes. This is why power and manipulation are inseparable. This is why the study of gaslighting must not be confined to philosophy. It must be understood as a tool, as a method of domination. Your fortress is only as strong as the territory surrounding it, and I control that territory. I determine the rules of engagement. I create the conditions. And under such conditions, even minds as formidable as yours would begin to waver. This is not philosophy. This is reality.
The debate exposes a chasm between two understandings of the human mind. Marcus Aurelius speaks from the realm of ideals. He describes what the mind could become through discipline and virtue. He speaks of fortresses and rational citadels, of a consciousness so refined that it becomes impervious to external manipulation. And there is profound truth in this vision. The human mind, properly trained, possesses remarkable capacity to resist distortion. Yet, Machiavelli speaks from the realm of power. He describes not what the mind could become, but what it actually is in the context of dependency, fear, and isolation. He reveals that reason itself can become a weapon against the reasoner, that intelligence can be turned inward to create self-doubt. He shows that the conditions surrounding a mind matter enormously. A fortress built upon sand will collapse regardless of how magnificently designed. Perhaps the deepest insight lies in their disagreement itself. Both are correct, but they address different questions. Marcus asks, what defenses can the mind construct? Machiavelli asks, under what conditions do those defenses fail? The victim of gaslighting is not simply a person who has failed at philosophy. The victim is a person whose circumstances have been deliberately engineered to make philosophy impossible. They are exhausted, isolated, afraid, dependent. In such states, even the trained mind struggles. Yet this recognition need not be pessimistic. It is, in fact, liberating. For if the vulnerability lies not in the architecture of reason itself, but in the conditions that surround it, then the defense lies not merely in individual discipline, but in community, in economic independence, in the cultivation of relationships and structures that do not permit isolation. The fortress must be defended not only by thought, but by the real world around it. This is the truth the first debate reveals. Gaslighting is not a battle of ideals alone. It is a battle in which power, circumstance, community, and personal discipline all play a role. And the person who wishes to resist must understand all these dimensions.
The power of illusion, gaslighting as a tool of domination.
You wish to understand the true power of gaslighting? Then abandon the notion that it is a battle between equals. It is not. Gaslighting is the weapon of the powerful against those who are vulnerable. It works because it exploits the fundamental human need to believe in one's competence, one's sanity, one's grip on reality. But more than this, it exploits the victim's need for the perpetrator's approval. Consider the nature of authority. A man who holds power over another, whether as employer, parent, partner, or leader, possesses an asymmetrical advantage. The subordinate has invested in the relationship. They have built their life, their identity, their security upon the perpetrator's goodwill. To doubt the perpetrator means to doubt the foundation of one's existence. This is the leverage that makes gaslighting so devastating. I will illustrate. A servant believes his master promised him payment for his labor. The master denies this vehemently. I made no such promise. You are inventing grievances. This is typical of your character, always seeking to be wronged, always imagining slights. Now, the servant possesses a clear memory. He recalls the conversation. Yet he also knows something essential. He cannot afford to be in conflict with this man. His livelihood depends upon continued employment. His reputation in the community depends upon his relationship with this master. So what does he do? He begins to doubt himself. Perhaps he misunderstood. Perhaps his memory is faulty. The master seems so certain, and the master's certainty is amplified by the servant's vulnerability. This is the architecture of domination. It is not crude violence. Crude violence leaves marks. It generates resistance. But gaslighting leaves no marks. It generates confusion, self-doubt, gratitude even. The victim comes to believe that the perpetrator is actually trying to help them, trying to correct their distorted thinking, trying to guide them toward a better understanding of reality. Throughout history, those who have understood power have grasped this principle. The church told the people they were sinful, depraved, unworthy. The people, despite evidence to the contrary, believed it. The aristocracy told the common people they were inferior by nature, unfit for self-governance. The people believed it. The colonial powers told the colonized that their own cultures were primitive and worthless, and many of the colonized came to believe it. This is gaslighting on a civilizational scale. The genius is that the victim becomes complicit in their own oppression. They police their own thinking. They doubt their own experiences. They seek the perpetrator's approval, even as the perpetrator diminishes them. The victim becomes invested in defending the perpetrator's narrative, because admitting the truth would require them to confront the terrifying reality that they are trapped, that they have been deceived, that they have surrendered their autonomy to someone who has no interest in their well-being. And here is what your philosophy, Aurelius, fails to account for. In such conditions, the very act of critical thinking becomes dangerous. The servant who questions too deeply, who asserts his own judgment too forcefully, risks losing his position. The child who contradicts the parent risks isolation or punishment. The partner who insists on their own perception risks abandonment. So the mind learns not to question. It learns to accommodate. It learns to doubt itself. This is not a failure of reason. This is the rational response to a situation designed to punish reason.
You speak as though human beings were merely passive vessels, accepting whatever narrative is imposed upon them. But this is a profound misunderstanding of human nature. Yes, we are vulnerable. Yes, circumstances matter. But we are also capable of remarkable resistance. History is not a simple story of perpetrators triumphing through gaslighting. History is replete with examples of people who resisted, who refused the imposed narrative, who chose truth over comfort. You present the servant as helpless, inevitably doubting himself. But consider the servant who has cultivated inner independence. Yes, he may fear losing his position, but he has not staked his entire identity upon it. He has maintained connections to others. He has pursued learning. He has engaged in practices that remind him of his own worth independent of his master's approval. Such a man, when confronted with gaslighting, experiences it differently. He feels the pressure, certainly, but he has an internal reference point that the perpetrator cannot reach. Your history, the church, the aristocracy, the colonial powers, tells only half the story. Yes, these institutions employed gaslighting, but they did not succeed absolutely. Mystics and philosophers, common people and revolutionaries resisted. They cultivated doubt about the imposed narrative. They maintained alternative sources of authority and truth. They built communities of resistance. The Stoics, for instance, taught precisely this practice of inner independence, the understanding that virtue, wisdom, and truth cannot be taken from you by external power. What you fail to recognize is that the vulnerability you describe is not inevitable. It is cultivated. It is taught. A person raised to trust their own perception, educated to think critically, connected to communities that affirm their reality, defended by structures that protect their autonomy, such a person is far less vulnerable to gaslighting. The problem is not that gaslighting is irresistible. The problem is that we have created societies in which people are systematically prevented from developing the capacities that would allow them to resist. Moreover, there is a paradox in your position, Machiavelli. You celebrate the power of the gaslighter. But this power is ultimately fragile. It depends upon the victim's continued cooperation, their continued investment in the relationship, their continued belief in the perpetrator's authority. The moment the victim recognizes the manipulation, the moment they reconnect with their own judgment, the power evaporates. The gaslighter's most dangerous enemy is not a stronger gaslighter. It is a person who has cultivated sufficient inner conviction that they cannot be shaken.
You are right that circumstances matter enormously. I do not deny this. But you are wrong that circumstances determine consciousness absolutely. There is always a space for choice, however constrained. And the cultivation of philosophical practice is precisely the practice of expanding that space, of learning to choose well within whatever constraints exist. This is not naive idealism. This is realism about human possibility.
You speak beautifully, Aurelius, but your examples reveal the limitations of your philosophy. You cite those who resisted, the mystics, the philosophers, the revolutionaries. But how many were there, and what was the cost of their resistance? The vast majority of people living under oppressive systems did not resist. They accommodated. They accepted the imposed narrative. And you attribute this to their failure to cultivate inner independence. but I attributed to something more accurate. The system was designed to make such cultivation nearly impossible.
Your servant who has connections, who has pursued learning, who maintains alternative communities, such a man is not representative. He is privileged. He has access to resources that most people do not have. Most servants did not have time for philosophical practice. They were exhausted, they were hungry, they were terrified. The church did not oppose educational institutions because it is opposed to learning. It opposed them because education is a threat to authority. Those who controlled access to information controlled reality itself. Your point about the fragility of the gaslighter's power is partially correct, but you misunderstand how this fragility is managed. Perpetrators do not rely upon blind obedience. They rely on something far more sophisticated: the victim's internalization of the abusive narrative. The victim comes to police themselves. They come to believe that doubting the perpetrator is a sign of their own pathology. Resistance becomes psychologically unbearable, not because of external punishment, but because of internal conflict. Furthermore, systems of gaslighting have learned to adapt. They do not rely on a single authority. They distribute authority across multiple institutions: the family, the state, the religion, the marketplace. Each institution gaslights in slightly different ways, but they reinforce each other. When the victim attempts to resist one institution by appealing to another, they find that the other institution reinforces the same fundamental narrative. The victim is surrounded by a web of validation for the imposed reality. You are right that I celebrate the power of the gaslighter, but I do so not out of admiration. I do so out of clear-eyed recognition of how power actually functions in the world. And those who deny this reality, who insist that inner virtue is sufficient, that reason can overcome any circumstance, are potentially dangerous. They offer false hope to those trapped in gaslighting situations. They suggest that the problem lies in the victim's inadequate philosophy, rather than in the perpetrator's deliberate malice. This is a form of secondary victimization. The truth is this: gaslighting is most effective precisely when the perpetrator is sophisticated enough to convince the victim that the manipulation is the victim's own thinking. The system becomes invisible. The victim cannot locate the source of their confusion, so they look inward.
This debate moves beyond the individual mind into the realm of power structures. Machiavelli reveals something deeply uncomfortable: that gaslighting is not an aberration. It is a systematic feature of hierarchical societies. Power flows downward. Reality is determined from above. Those who control the narrative control the world. And the most sophisticated forms of control work not through external coercion, but through the internalization of the imposed narrative by the victim themselves. Yet Marcus offers an essential counterpoint. The history of human resistance suggests that consciousness cannot be absolutely controlled. People do resist. People do maintain alternative truths. People do refuse the imposed narrative. The question is not whether resistance is possible, but under what conditions it becomes likely. And here, both philosophers point toward truth. Resistance requires both internal cultivation and external support. An individual practicing Stoic discipline in complete isolation will eventually succumb. But an individual practicing such discipline while connected to communities, engaged with alternative sources of knowledge and validation, protected by structures that defend autonomy, such an individual becomes nearly impossible to gaslight. The most disturbing insight of this debate, however, is the one Machiavelli implies: that systems of power have evolved to make such conditions rare. We live in societies that systematically isolate people, that concentrate information in the hands of institutions, that teach people to doubt their own perceptions while trusting external authorities. In this context, gaslighting is not exceptional. It is the normal operation of power. The question becomes, how do we create conditions in which resistance is possible? How do we build societies that cultivate the very capacities? Independent thinking, connection to others, access to alternative truths, that make people resistant to manipulation. This is the territory the debate opens. It moves from the philosophical to the political. And it suggests that defending ourselves against gaslighting is not merely an individual task. It is a collective one.
Rational immunity, building defenses against manipulators.
The synthesis begins with this recognition. Machiavelli is correct that circumstances profoundly shape consciousness. But I remain convinced that within those circumstances, there exists always a space for choice. Small, perhaps, but real. And in that space, the practices I have advocated, observation of one's own thought, examination of evidence, cultivation of virtue, become not luxuries, but necessities. The first defense against gaslighting is therefore internal, the development of what we might call intellectual integrity. This means committing to pursue truth even when truth is uncomfortable. It means noticing when you are motivated to believe something not because evidence supports it, but because belief serves your emotional needs or your position. Most people are not corrupted by the gaslighter. They are corrupted by themselves, by their willingness to believe what is convenient. But the second defense is external, the deliberate cultivation of connection and community. The victim of gaslighting is isolated. They have no alternative sources of validation. But if you maintain relationships with people who are independent, who are willing to contradict you, who have no stake in your particular perception, then you possess what the perpetrator fears most: external reference points. If a man tells you that you are crazy, but 5 other people you trust confirm that you are sane, the manipulation loses its power. The third defense is structural, the creation of systems and institutions that protect autonomy. This means economic independence where possible. It means legal protections. It means education that teaches people to think critically. It means the distribution of information rather than its concentration. These are not merely nice ideals. They are practical necessities for a society that wishes to resist systematic gaslighting. And the fourth defense is what I would call epistemological discipline, the cultivation of careful ways of knowing. This means writing things down rather than relying on memory alone. It means seeking corroboration before accepting claims that matter. It means remaining suspicious of certainty, particularly the certainty of those in power. It means understanding that reality is complex and that simple, elegant narratives should be approached with caution.
You speak as though these defenses were equally available to all. They are not. Economic independence is a privilege denied to most. Legal protections are instruments of power themselves. Critical education is precisely what authoritarian systems seek to prevent. But I acknowledge your point. Aurelius has identified the actual mechanisms of resistance. The question is, for whom are they accessible? What you describe as intellectual integrity, I recognize as a form of power. Those who have the leisure to examine their thoughts, who are not exhausted by survival, who have not been taught their entire lives to submit to authority, such people are better positioned to practice this discipline. But the system will not allow such people to emerge if it can prevent it. And thus we encounter a circularity. The defenses against gaslighting require conditions that gaslighting systems deliberately destroy. Yet here too I find a point of agreement. You are correct that community is the gaslighter's greatest enemy. When I mentioned that power works through isolation, I was incomplete. Power is most complete when isolation is combined with the victim's belief that they alone perceive reality distorted. But when even two people recognize each other's sanity, when they confirm each other's perceptions, the manipulation becomes difficult. The perpetrator can dismiss one person, but two, three, a community? This begins to threaten the perpetrator's narrative. The practical reality, therefore, is this. Resistance to gaslighting requires what we might call strategic noncompliance. It requires people to maintain just enough independent consciousness to question the imposed narrative. It requires finding others who are doing the same. It requires the development of what might be called counter-narratives, alternative stories about reality that preserve dignity and allow for the possibility of freedom. This is not a complete solution, but it is something. I will go further. I believe that the most effective resistance to gaslighting is not the isolated philosopher perfecting his virtue, but the community that has learned to trust each other's perception even when authority denies it. The women who gather in secret and share stories of their experiences. The workers who talk among themselves despite prohibition. The colonized people who maintain their own language and myths despite pressure to assimilate. In these acts, resistance is born.
And here, Machiavelli, we find ourselves in genuine agreement. The defenses I advocate are not intended to be pursued in isolation. They are meant to be woven into the fabric of community and institutions. The Stoic practice of examining one's thoughts is not an escape from the world. It is a preparation for engagement with it. When people gather who have cultivated this practice, who trust each other's judgment, who are willing to support each other in resistance, then something powerful emerges. This is the true immunity to gaslighting, not the fortress of the isolated mind, but the network of connected minds. Each person maintaining their capacity to think, to observe, to question. Each person connected to others who do the same. Each person embedded in institutions and communities that protect autonomy. This is not naive optimism. This is the recognition that our greatest power lies not in our individual invulnerability, but in our collective capacity to maintain reality in the face of those who would distort it. The path forward, therefore, requires work on two fronts simultaneously. The internal work of cultivating discipline, integrity, and clarity of thought, and the external work of building communities, institutions, and structures that make such clarity possible. Neither alone is sufficient. Together, they create something that gaslighting cannot penetrate.
The final debate reveals what both philosophers have been moving toward. That resistance to gaslighting is neither a matter of individual philosophy nor of external circumstances alone, but of their integration. The person who has cultivated inner discipline but lives in complete isolation remains vulnerable. But the community that lacks any individual capacity for critical thought remains vulnerable to collective manipulation. Immunity emerges at the intersection. The practical implications are clear. Those wishing to resist gaslighting must work simultaneously on multiple levels. Individually, they must cultivate practices that sharpen perception and strengthen conviction. Relationally, they must build connections with others who are doing the same work. Institutionally, they must support systems that protect autonomy and distribute power. And societally, they must advocate for the conditions that make such work possible: education, economic security, access to information, legal protections. Moreover, the debate suggests something uncomfortable, that in societies where gaslighting is systematic, where isolation is built in, where alternative narratives are suppressed, where critical thought is discouraged, resistance will be difficult and costly. There are no easy paths, but there are paths. And they begin with the recognition that both the capacity for reason and the need for community are essential. The person who maintains both and who helps others to do the same becomes a source of liberation in a world designed for control. The journey through these timeless minds leaves us with an uncomfortable clarity. Gaslighting thrives where isolation breathes doubt and where systems hide truth behind veils of authority. Yet resistance is not a solitary endeavor. It flourishes when individual discipline meets collective connection. Marcus shows us the path of rigorous self-examination, while Machiavelli reveals the necessity of strategic alliances and vigilance against domination. In the end, immunity is crafted not alone, but in networks of trust, dialogue, and shared courage. To build defenses against manipulation is to pursue truth not only within ourselves, but alongside those willing to see and speak clearly. The question now is not merely how you guard your own mind, but how you help others do the same. If this exploration reshaped how you see power and perception, subscribe to our channel. Join the debate, share your insights, and strengthen your own rational immunity. Darkness recedes when minds unite. Your voice can be the difference.